It's back to school season, and Clorox is donating 2 million disinfecting wipes to classrooms across America. Because back to school means things can get a little bit messy. Just ask second grade teacher Mr. Torres.
Put me and just one Clorox wipe on a team? We can take on crayon smudges, sticky fingerprints on every surface, sneezes on the door handle, juice box explosion by the sink, snack crumbs, and don't even get me started on the bathroom passes.
Clorox disinfecting wipes. Teacher's #1 wipe.
Think about it. Bathroom passes.
Clean feels good. Based on unit sales data.
Anyone can follow. It takes something special to be an original, which is why the 2025 Lincoln Navigator SUV arrives with new ways of surrounding you in luxury, including the ultra-wide 48-inch panoramic display and the multi-sensory Lincoln Rejuvenate experience. A true original never stops evolving. So meet the 2025 Navigator, the original that's all new and better than ever. Learn more at Lincoln.com. Lincoln and Navigator are trademarks of Ford or its affiliates.
Hello everyone, this is Fortune's Wheel and I am your host Jonathan, and today we're continuing our first Patreon series called Poland Finds Its Place. I want to sincerely thank you all who are listening to this, as you've generously donated to the production of this podcast and shown that you believe in what's happening here. There are no words for my appreciation, so I'll simply offer another heartfelt thank you. So, back to our first members only series. This is episode 6, what I thought was going to be our last episode, but we will have one more it looks like. Episode 6 is entitled The Worthy Brother. I hope you enjoy the show. We find our narrative in the early to mid 1070s, and we're going to set up the coronation of Bolesław II, now king of a renewed kingdom of Poland. But let's take a look at the broader medieval world at this point. By this time, England's been undergoing a slow and violent metamorphosis for about 10 years. Rodrigo Diaz, El Cid, is tearing things up across Christian and Muslim Iberia, and there's no end in sight there yet. And Europe as a whole, specifically in the year 1076, is reeling from a recent decree issued by Pope Gregory VII, which is where we find our introduction to this episode. Not in Poland, rather Rome, the heart of the Papal States. See, from the Lateran Palace upon the Caelian Hill, which is a hill named in Rome after heaven itself actually, the Latin word for heaven is caelum. The Caelian Hill, overlooking business and bustle of Rome's markets in the slight valley between it and the Palatine Hill across the way. Well, there on that hill, Poland's history would be rewritten in a way. In the distance, the Tiber's flowing waters, while this was happening, glittered brightly beneath the Latium sun on its course to spill peacefully into the Tyrrhenian Sea to Rome's west. Quite different from life experienced up north. Now, to the northwest of the Caelian Hill, down in the valley, the Grand Colosseum lay empty, and to its south, up and over the prominent Palatine Hill, the magnificent ruins of the Circus Maximus. These two forgotten relics of a long-gone age were also in view of the Pope, there in the Lateran Palace, back up on Caelian Hill, as he signed letters that were prepared shortly afterward and sent to his far northern archbishoprics and their political figureheads. Again, the year was 1076, and Pope Gregory VII, though Pope for only 3 years at this point, had spent at least 20 years strutting powerfully through the hallowed halls of the Curia in Rome, and he had mastered the art of not giving a single you-know-what as to what people thought about him. And he always led a very vocal opposition to the political authority of kings around the continent and emperors. In fact, though it might have been a foregone conclusion that he would become the next pope, he'd also created a number of very powerful enemies along the way, including one, Henry IV, king of both Germany and Italy, thus emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So in 1076, Pope Gregory VII was keen on continuing to push his momentum towards squashing imperial ambitions, from Castile and Leon to Kiev. Poland seemed like a hill upon which to let someone else die for him, possibly. You know, the hallmark of a powerful leader. Mix a guy like Gregory VII with a guy like Poland's Bolesław II, and you've got yourself a formidable opposition to German authority right smack in the middle of things. And make this Bolesław II guy into a king, and he's instantly broken away from that same German king's circle of control. And remember that Poland was already leaning heavily eastward with marriage alliances in Kiev, as well as the capital now in the southeast of Poland. And speaking of their friends to the east, back in 1075, Bolesław had ridden into Bohemia, at the time still a duchy of Emperor Henry IV's. He'd ridden into Bohemia with his friend Grand Prince Vladimir II Monomakh of Kiev. This, Bolesław knew, was on the heels of the pretty rough Saxon rebellion of 1073 to 1074 back in Germany, a rebellion spurred on by Pope Gregory VII to a certain extent. So, there was a lot leading up to this day in 1076, and on Christmas Day, 1076, Bolesław II shook off his German yoke in favor of a papal-approved Polish crown, reviving the Kingdom of Poland once again after about 40 years of it being but a memory. And when just 1 year later, in 1077, in an event I hope to flesh out more later on the main podcast, when Henry IV takes his famous walk to Canossa, he will be forced to recognize King Bolesław II of Poland publicly as a legitimate king among kings. And while Henry IV was barefooting his way across Italy, Bolesław II took advantage of the emperor's weak moment and moved against Hungary and Kiev. Yeah, Kiev of all places. Now this surprised many, including his own lords who'd become used to the Hungarians and the Kievans being allies. But Bolesław II saw an opportunity to expand Polish influence in the region, and he took it, for better or for worse. And I'd say for all intents and purposes, these moves probably didn't serve the Polish people very well in the long run. Part of his move on Hungary entailed the propping up of the former Hungarian king's son, Ladislaus I, who was son of King Bela I. Now this right here would be a good move. Well, for him. You know, another hallmark of a great leader, thinking only about yourself and not your people. But we'll get to that part later. Now, mixing two men, as we said, like this, seemed like bad news to Emperor Henry IV, but Henry held his ground pretty well, all things considered. However, alliances during the Middle Ages rarely lasted very long, and, to Henry's pleasant surprise, Gregory and Bolesław's pact fizzled shortly after it was made. Adam Zamoyski, in his book The Polish Way, writes, quote, "The fiery king's friendship with the papacy came to grief only 3 years after this event." End quote. Yeah, this is where Bolesław II's attitude got himself into some trouble. Zamoyski continues, quote, "Less than a century after his namesake had made such mileage out of a saint, Bolesław lost his throne over one." End quote. Now, I love this quote, so we're going to flesh it out just a bit. This is in reference to something I plan to also flesh out on the main podcast, but suffice it to say, Pope Gregory VII wasn't exactly the most beloved of all the popes, but he was certainly one of the more forceful and energetic and productive ones, especially in the 11th century. Zamoyski's quote actually points to something in John Julius Norwich's book, Absolute Monarchs, which reads, quote, "Pope Gregory VII's strength lay, above all, in the singleness of his purpose. Throughout his life, he was guided by one overmastering ideal, the subjection of all Christendom, from the two emperors down to the authority of the Church of Rome. The Church could make them and unmake them. It could also absolve their subjects from their allegiances. But just as the Church must be supreme upon earth, so too must the Pope be supreme in the Church. He was the judge of all men himself, responsible only to God. His word was not only law, it was the divine law. Disobedience to him was therefore something very close to mortal sin. All this and much more was spelled out in his 27 propositions, known as Dictatus Papae, published in 1075. These included the assertion that all popes, by definition, are saints, inheriting their sanctity from St. Peter. End quote. Well, that is quite telling, to be honest, when it comes to trying to figure out who this Gregory VII guy was and why he made certain moves that he made. So Zamoyski's line about less than a century after his namesake had made such mileage out of a saint, if you remember, well, this points directly back to Bolesław I around the turn of the millennium, going above and beyond in his honoring Bishop Adalbert, who was horribly murdered while on a mission in Prussia to the north. Bolesław I was empowered by this. He was honored by this. And eventually he made himself his own kingdom, piggybacking off of the events since his worshiping and his honoring of Bishop Adalbert. His treatment of an actual saint, because again, Adalbert became a saint. Now, Zamoyski continues, quote, "A number of magnates, including Stanislav, Bishop of Krakow, had started to plot against him. When Bolesław uncovered the conspiracy, he reacted with his usual violence, putting to death a number of the conspirators, including the bishop. It was a move that aroused widespread indignation, and the unfortunate king was obliged to abandon his throne to his brother, Władysław Herman." End quote. In fact, other sources say, including Gallus Anonymous, that it was Bolesław II's own sword that was driven through the bishop during Mass. That's just cold. Now, Zamoyski's earlier line about Bolesław lost his throne over one, that is, a saint, well, that line is in reference to this. That same Bishop Stanislav from Krakow would later be canonized. Now, Gregory VII also believed that though he was at the top of every hierarchy in Christendom, his archbishops, his bishops, his other clergy, well, they were all extensions of him, of his will, which is in direct agreement to Norwich's words earlier about Pope Gregory VII's overall attitude toward papal authority, when he said, again, disobedience to him was therefore something very close to mortal sin. Now, how was Bolesław II ever going to overcome his murder of this bishop? Well, as we know, he didn't. He abdicated his crown after just 3 years, and he gave it to his brother, hightailing it south. And here we go, here's a little wraparound here, hightailing it south to Hungary, which was still being ruled by the man he'd pushed to be king just a couple years earlier. Things were fairly stable in Hungary, all things considered. But, well, when you're guilty of publicly murdering a bishop during Mass, well, there probably aren't too many places who will welcome you wholeheartedly. And when you show up like a belligerent drunk uncle and treating everybody like garbage, well, it's no wonder that Bolesław II was assassinated by the year 1082. Bolesław II was called the Bold. But it wasn't for reasons you'd initially assume upon hearing it. They called him bold, not for his daring, not for his courage, but for his audacity and for his pride. I think there's a lesson in there for all of us, I suppose. So what kind of kingdom had Bolesław II left to Władysław Herman? Well, it depends on your measurement, I suppose. First of all, we need to start with the most important thing, that Bolesław II didn't leave him a kingdom. When Bolesław was forced out, Poland was once again driven into the arms of Germany as a duchy. So Władysław Herman didn't even have a kingdom, which is kind of sad, I suppose. Now, some good points were that the economies across the duchy had rebounded under Bolesław II, and they continued to rebound and prosper under Władysław Herman. So Kievan traders, they poured in from the east. Gdansk had grown. Hungarian merchants and Saxon merchants, they all brought wares from around the continent into Poland. And Poland was in a much better position after years of regrowth and rebuilding. If you remember, the Bohemians raced down just a couple decades earlier and kind of laid waste to the place a little bit. And they were in a position to push their wares and services outside of their borders as well. So things were going fairly well in the 1070s and into the 1080s for Poland at the time, economically. Now, another good thing was that everyone around, even Emperor Henry IV to an extent, well, they knew to keep a safe distance from Poland. Bolesław II had attacked Bohemia on numerous occasions throughout the 1060s, so everyone knew that this hothead could blow his top at any moment. So if you were going to pick a fight with him, you'd best be ready to bring everything you have, or just don't pick a fight with the guy. Now, by 1079, Bolesław II had stirred up some unnecessary trouble, too. He'd, as we just said, killed a bishop. Never really a smart political move in the Middle Ages. Local lords, under this burgeoning feudal system that we introduced last time, were coming into their own as well, and though still loyal to their king, they were getting more vocal and more upset with the lack of response to their various plights, and though they were all well aware that Duke Bolesław II was always, boisterous and even prideful, well, this new King Bolesław II was a bit more intense. And by bit, I mean a lot. And by intense, I mean pretty ridiculous. Simply put, Polish lords were fed up with following such a narcissistic man, despite the security and prominence he brought with him, as well as the resurgence of the nation's once great status in the world. Zamoyski writes, quote, "At home, Władysław was unable to curb the rising power of local lords, who stipulated that Poland should be divided between his two sons at his death." End quote.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
Leading a business today means constantly adapting. On the Executive Insights podcast, brought to you by AWS, global leaders share how they're making tough calls, testing bold ideas, and putting innovation into practice, generative AI included. If you're looking for real stories behind what's working, this is it. Subscribe to the Executive Insights podcast today, available now on all major podcast platforms.
Now, the consequences of this become very important later in Polish history, later, that is, in about 20 years. But for now, it doesn't change the fact that Władysław Herman, the new Duke of Poland, had his hands stuffed full of the crap that his brother left him to sort out. Now, Władysław Herman was the second son. Let's introduce this guy. I think it's important. He was the second son of Casimir the Restorer. His mother was Maria Dobrynega from Kiev, thus further strengthening the bond between the two polities. Now, Władysław Herman was one of those interesting figures in the background of history because he was never destined to become king or duke or whatever. Bolesław II, his older brother, he was always that guy. As the second son, he was simply the first loser in the whole royal hierarchy of things, but the lords chose him to succeed whom they saw to be a burgeoning tyrant in their midst. So there he was, Duke of Poland in 1079. He quickly got to work repairing some of the burnt bridges around Poland and among its neighbors. Could he have seen himself as the next restorer? Well, who knows? But he wasted no time, as within 1 year of him becoming duke, he married into the Przemysliv dynasty ruling Bohemia at the time. Now, her name was Judith, and she was in her mid-20s, which is a little late at the time for such things. But she would serve her duty to forge an alliance between Bohemia and Poland. Honestly, something desperately needed in the area at the time. She was unable to conceive, sadly for unknown reasons. Could have been her, could have been her husband, we'll never know, but unfortunately, the woman was always to blame at that time. Well, she was unable to conceive until August of 1086. That's 5 years after she married, when she brought a son into this world, a future ruler of Poland named Bolesław III. But sadly, by December, lingering complications from her pregnancy and birth caused her death. Unfortunately, as there always were, political issues needed to be resettled upon Judith of Bohemia's death. Namely, well, were Poland and Bohemia going to continue their alliance, their tenuous friendship? Well, time's going to tell on that one. Now, in the meantime, Władysław Herman had much bigger other things to worry about. Władysław II would throw everything off in 1085, when he received approval from Emperor Henry IV himself to his Duke of Bohemia to become king of a new kingdom of Bohemia. And what's more, he allowed Bohemia to become suzerain over Poland, which was a real shock to the Polish system, let me tell you. However, it was really only in words, as it wasn't tested much and Poland simply ignored it. And Władysław Herman continued the practice of laughing away the tribute owed to Bohemia for Silesia too. So whatever teeth Bohemia had, they weren't sharp enough to draw Polish blood. Now, Władysław Herman had the opportunity to branch out again and make connections, and he made one from a much higher status than the daughter of a Bohemian duke. Władysław Herman married into the emperor's royal family in 1089. Her name was originally Judith of Swabia, and she had been the queen of Hungary for a spell, under the usurper who had kicked out that same Hungarian king, Bela I that we mentioned earlier, remember him? Well, Bela I's son was propped up by Bolesław II. Small world, right? Well, when he died, that Hungarian king, Judith eventually landed in Poland. And this union went a very long way in mending some broken fences between the two countries, that of Poland and Germany. She became known as Sophia after their wedding. I mean, who wants to be named the same name as the ex-wife, right? But not everything was great when she entered the duchy. See, Judith, Sophia, whatever. I'm calling her Judith of Swabia for future reference. See, Judith had played the Game of Thrones for a long, long time already. She was born and raised in the German court. She was betrothed to a French king before his death. She was queen consort in Hungary. And she was now snuggling up with some Polish lord. Oop, did I say that out loud? Well, the cat's out of the bag, I guess. So, yeah, it's rumored that she was shacking up with some other lord behind Władysław's back. And it wasn't just a few dalliances either. No, she was stirring pots and letting them boil over long after she escaped out the back door. We'll learn about some of her conniving and some of her trickeries on a future episode, but suffice it to say, Judith was a sneaky, intelligent, and powerful woman. And I suspect that she might have opened some doors for something that happened under Władysław's reign. Since Bolesław II was banished, Władysław Herman, as I said, was dealing with some growing urgency among his lordly class. That is, his knights and lords were growing in power and growing in their own audacity. There was this to deal with. Władysław Herman, like I said, was trying his best, it seems, to get Poland back into the swing of things, and building churches was a great way to get on the ecclesiastical good side, especially after the last guy, your brother. What did he do? He murdered a bishop. Probably a good idea. Let's build some churches. But unfortunately, when your wife is even working against you, well, it's a pretty uphill climb. So Władysław Herman had fathered one son, as we mentioned, with Judith of Bohemia during his first marriage. Well, this boy's name was Bolesław III, again, who would become known to history as Bolesław III Wrymouth. And as Zamoyski writes, quote, "As his name suggests, he was an ugly, cunning, sardonic man, but he was also extremely capable and quickly earned the respect and even the love of his subjects, in spite of his determination to rule with a strong arm." End quote. Now, more about Bolesław III Wrymouth in due time, but his mere existence throws the succession crisis off kilter. By the time Judith/Sophia of Swabia comes into the picture, he's 3 years old, and within just a few years, the decision needs to be made to raise the boy for military and other sorts of leadership, or, I don't know, something else, something not ruling Poland. And we can't forget about Bolesław II's son, Władysław Herman's nephew, named Mieszko. Yes, another Mieszko, who was now 17 at the time. Now, once again, there was a lot at stake in who should succeed Władysław Herman, and once again, European powers nearly crippled by a silly succession dilemma. Well, right away, in 1089, nephew Mieszko was inexplicably dead, so there goes one threat. And the second, Judith, well, she blessed Władysław Herman and Poland with 4 girls. Please don't shoot the messenger here, but that didn't help succession dilemmas at all in the Middle Ages. So it was still left to Bolesław III Wrymouth, but as we said, Judith and her lover had other plans. Other plans that we'll get to on the next and last episode of our first Patreon series on Poland's exciting 11th century. I hope you'll tune in. Thank you for listening. Until next time.